Good evening, and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Henrietta Toivonen, and I'm one of the Ath Fellows this year. How do we define acts of racial discrimination, and where do we see them in society? There are clear cases, such as racial profiling by law enforcement authorities, that are widely discussed and receive a lot of attention in media. But how about the more discreet, but still highly meaningful, ways in which race affects our position and opportunities in society? Our speaker tonight will address this question. Randall Kennedy is a professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He's a prolific author and has been awarded the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for his book, Race, Crime, and the Law. Professor Kennedy writes and speaks on a wide range of topics, addressing sensitive racial issues and challenging audiences to confront their own racial biases, as well as the intolerance embedded in society. Professor Kennedy's Athenaeum speech is co-sponsored by the Presidency Leadership Fund. And as always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kennedy to the Athenaeum.
Thank you very much for the gracious introduction, and I'd like to thank everyone who has been so gracious in hosting me. I've had a very full day here. Beginning with a breakfast meeting with the president of the college, and subsequent to that, I've had meetings with administrators and students and teachers. I had the great pleasure of going to a class. It's been a very full day, very interesting day, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to talk about a project that's, this is not a fully worked out project. This is a project that I'm working on, and I'm going to give you my thinking on it thus far, and I'm going to hope that you'll help me with it. This project stems from the following thought. On April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his last speech. It's a famous speech, and in this speech, he said that he had been to the mountaintop. And he said to his followers, I've been to the mountaintop, and I can assure you that I've glimpsed the promised land. He said, I might not get there with you, but I have glimpsed the promised land. And he assured his followers that they would someday soon reach the promised land. Now, what Martin Luther King Jr. omitted to say was, well, what does the promised land look like? What are its boundaries? What's its topography? What are the key landmarks? Now, since then, there's been a lot of discussion about various aspects of the American race question. Lots of writing, lots of talking. But this question of what the racial promised land, what is it? What does it look like? What should we be seeking to create? That seems to me to be a question that has not gotten the attention that it warrants. Again, there are lots of people who talk about race, activists, commentators, politicians. All of them say that they're in favor, of course, of racial justice. I would assume that in an audience like this, there's a wide range of ideological positions that are represented here. I would bet that Donald Trump would, of course, say that he's in favor of racial justice. I'm sure that Bernie Sanders would say he's in favor of racial justice. The same would be true of Hillary Clinton. The same would be true of you name it. Racial justice, racial equality, racial decency. Everybody says they're in favor of those things. But beneath the abstraction, what does it mean specifically? Our law doesn't help us all that much. You would think that the law would have, again, after all of these lawsuits, after all of the effort that has been put into trying to clarify the meaning of the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, after the thousands of cases that have been litigated stemming from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, heck, go back to the first federal Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. You mean to tell me that after all of that, we're still trying to come to grips with what we want? Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. Now, there are certain conceptions of the racial promised land. Let me put one on the table. The idea of a race-blind America. That's a conception, and in fact, I think that that's probably the ascendant conception. I would bet that if you just went out right now and asked people, what do you want? What is it that we're after? What is the sort of society in racial terms that we should be seeking to create? I think a lot of people would say, oh, a race-blind America. Now, that idea certainly it has some real virtues to it. Real virtues. One virtue of the idea of the race-blind America as our conception of what we're trying to accomplish, the idea of the race-blind America as our racial promised land, one good thing about it is that it does represent a clear break from an awful past practice. It is certainly a repudiation of pigmentocracy, and that's a good thing. I mean, if you're for a race-blind America, you're certainly repudiating racial slavery, you're repudiating racial segregation, you're repudiating white supremacy. It's a good thing. A second good thing about the idea of a race-blind America is that it does show a healthy skepticism regarding the ability of individuals and institutions to distinguish between various sorts of racial distinctions. I mean, after all, racial distinctions have long been part of American life, including part of American life after the Reconstruction Amendments. I mean, people, we got to remember, people, we now sneer at the idea that segregation, we sneer at the idea, how could people have ever thought that racial segregation was consistent with the idea of the equal protection of the laws? And how could people have ever thought that? Well, a lot of smart people thought that segregation was consistent with the equal protection of the laws. Oliver Wendell Holmes did. Justice Cardozo did. I mean, it wasn't until 1954, the year that I was born, it wasn't until 1954 the Supreme Court of the United States got around to saying that, at least in public schooling, segregation was inconsistent with the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. So the idea of a race-blind America suggests skepticism about our ability to draw racial distinctions in a way that's not invidious. So the third thing that's a third virtue of the idea of the race-blind America is it has a nice clarity to it, or at least an apparent clarity. It has the bumper sticker advantage. What is it that you think would be a good racial regime for the United States? Well, a good racial regime would be a United States in which skin color was insignificant. It was as significant as eyeball color. Nobody talks about, blue eyes versus brown eyes. It's quite trivial. It doesn't have any moral significance. And some people say that's the way that skin color should be. Now, I've said that view has certain virtues. It does. It also has certain problems. Let's talk about a few problems that idea of the racial promised land would have. So, one is this. What would it mean to carry out a vigorous effort to extinguish race-minded decision-making? And if you really wanted to put that into practice in a vigorous way, what would that entail? Well, it would entail a level of intrusiveness upon privacy and freedom of association that many people would find profoundly obnoxious. I'll try to illustrate this just in one domain, a domain that I think would really hit home with this crowd, given your age. Dating. Very important thing. When you think about dating and its relationship to marriage, very important. We don't think of it as important, but it's hugely important in terms of the way in which friendship, courtship, dating, marriage has all sorts of implications insofar as valuable knowledge, access to employment. With respect to marriage, the distribution of property, distribution of income, distribution of wealth. Heck, decisions involving dating and marriage are among the most important decisions that people make. I think a lot of people would be absolutely appalled at the idea of a regime that policed individuals' decisions about dating or marriage in terms of race or anything else. I don't think people would be willing, at least, I think most people would be unwilling to permit a policing mechanism with respect to discrimination, racial discrimination, in that realm. Now, maybe I'm wrong. In a few minutes, I'll subside, and if I'm wrong, people can challenge me on that. But my assertion would be, I think even people who, would initially say, I'm for a, race-blind America, I think if you say, well, what about the policing of, marriage decision, dating decisions, adoption decisions? I think they say, oh, hold it, whoa, I don't know about that. What other problems would one face to really put into action a race-blind America? Well, it would entail, arguably, the destruction of racial refuges, racial identities, racial affinity groups. I mean, at many colleges, at many universities, many institutions all around the United States, we have affinity groups. I mean, when I was a law student, I remember I was an officer. The Yale Law School, Yale Black Law Students Association. This week, next week, I'm going to go to a dinner sponsored by the Harvard Black Law Students Association. I bet that at 99% of the colleges in the United States, you have, Latino associations, Black associations, Asian American associations. The idea of racially boundaried, racially defined affinity groups, very widespread. Well, if you were thoroughly committed to the idea of a race-blind America, what would be the status of those affinity groups? And indeed, if you really wanted to push the matter, what would be the status of these various racial groups at all? If you really wanted to push the idea of a race-blind America, maybe you would say that would entail the extinguishing of the idea of, let's say, Black America, or Latino America, or Asian America. There's some folks who would say, we should have just one America. Okay. What would that mean? I think a lot of people would resist the idea of the extinguishing of these various affinity groups. Now, at this point, I can imagine somebody saying, okay, listen, okay, I'm fine, Kennedy. Maybe I don't want a race-blind America, but I want race-blind constitutionalism. Maybe I don't want race blindness to be the regulation of all of our affairs, including private affairs, but I want race blindness to regulate public affairs. Okay? What about that? Again, that has some of the virtues of the race-blind America idea, but again, there's some real problems. One real big problem with the idea of colorblind constitutionalism is that when you really push it, no one's really for it. It's true. There's some people who say they're for it. So, for instance, let's take the two leading proponents of colorblind constitutionalism on the Supreme Court of the United States. The two leading proponents would be Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas. I think they're the two sort of most fervent proponents of colorblind constitutionalism. Both of them, if you put it to them and said, does this mean that the government should never, ever, ever be able to take race into account, they would say, well, we're not really willing to say that. We're willing to say that the government should not be able to take race into account on a routine basis. The government should not be able to take race into account generally. The government should not be able to take race into account unless it can show a compelling justification to take race into account. They're very careful to put an exception in there. Well, that's an exception. I think that's rather important. These exceptions are important. So, for instance, a couple of years ago, there was a case, California case, Johnson versus California. Could the state of California segregate prisoners on a racial basis for a certain period of time? The state of California wanted to do that for purposes of protection. They said, we've got these prison gangs. A lot of times these prison gangs are racial prison gangs. For the protection of the prisoners, we want to segregate the prisoners on a racial basis for a certain period of time when a prisoner first goes into prison. Supreme Court of the United States said, no, you can't do that. Who were the two dissenters on the Supreme Court? Antonin Scalia, Justice Thomas. They said, hey, safety is involved here. Now, frankly, I think they had a pretty good point. I think it was a close question, actually. I think that I think their position was a perfectly reasonable position, actually. I'm not saying I agree with their position. I said it was reasonable. But my point, the real point here is, they say that they're for colorblind constitutionalism, but here they were willing to have the state draw a race line. They're not alone. There are many proponents of colorblind constitutionalism who find themselves in the position of actually engaging in the drawing of race lines. Let me give you a couple of examples. One, since the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, there has always been at least one black person in a presidential cabinet since Lyndon Johnson. Prior to Lyndon Johnson, there had never been a black person in a cabinet. But since Lyndon Johnson, every president has had at least one black person in the cabinet. Is that accidental? No. And by the way, this includes presidents that said that they were in favor of colorblind constitutionalism and said that they were against policies like affirmative action. I'm thinking in particular of Ronald Reagan and of both Presidents Bush. All three blacks in the cabinet. And I don't think it was accidental. Let me give you another example. This one was an example drawn, just an autobiographical example. A couple of years ago, I had some friends who wrote a book. Book was a very fervent attack on affirmative action. Now, I've written a good bit about affirmative action. The last book I wrote was a book called For Discrimination. It's a book in favor, a defense of affirmative action. But I had some friends who wrote a critique of affirmative action. Well, a think tank had an event celebrating the publication of their book. And at this event, I was invited to come be on a panel and, speak about the book. And my friends gave their presentation, why they're against affirmative action. And this think tank, by the way, is thoroughly committed to being against affirmative action. My turn to speak comes up. I take the lectern and I said, congratulations on your book. I'm very pleased to be here, but I have a question. Here's my question. Did my race play any role in my being invited to speak here? I posit that it did. If I'm wrong, I can be corrected right now. But I think that it did, because I think that the people putting together this event probably thought to themselves, gosh, we can't have an event in which there are no people of color that are, participating, and this is a, event about affirmative action. It just won't go down. It won't, it'll just be, it'll look bad. It won't be legitimate. I mean, come on. So there's this, Kennedy guy out there, bring him in. I was not corrected. Let me give you a third example, drawn from a case argued before the Supreme Court recently. It's a case involving affirmative action at the University of Texas. You know, Texas, the Texas legislature, not known as a wildly progressive legislature, the Texas legislature passed a law saying that if you were in the top 10% of your class, you automatically got to go to the University of Texas. Now, the Texas legislature passed that law in part to assure a larger number of racial minorities going to the University of Texas. To my mind, that is itself affirmative action. That's race-minded. But a lot of people look at that law and pretend as though it's not race-minded. It is. And that, as far as I'm concerned, it's yet another example of how even people who say they're in favor of colorblind constitutionalism, when you push them real hard, they're not. I'm glad they're not. I think that I think that they are actually disabled from doing in practice what their ideological commitments would have them do. I'm glad they're disabled from doing in practice what their ideological commitments would have them do. Let me move on to an alternative conception of the racial promised land. I've been talking thus far about the race-blind, either race-blind America, race-blind constitutionalism. Let's go to an alternative formulation. And I'm sure that people in here have heard this alternative formulation in various ways. So nowadays, some people say, well, nah, I don't like that race-blind stuff. Rather, what we should have, our idea, our conception of the racial promised land should be America as a racial salad, right? Or racial mosaic, or racial orchestra, right? You know, you got to have some violins, you got to have a, tuba, you got to have various things to make the orchestra. Or another way, another formulation of this, another sort of metaphor, is the idea of institutions that look like America. So Bill Clinton, when he was, becomes president, he's trying to put together a cabinet. People are asking him, well, what kind of cabinet are you going to put together? He says pridefully, I'm going to put together a cabinet that looks like America. This look-like theme, this look-like America theme, I think, has really become quite popular. You hear it all the time. 2 weeks ago, when the Academy Awards were announced, or at least the Academy Award nominations were announced, outcry. This list of nominees, there's something wrong with this list. What's wrong with this list? It does not look like America. Various faculties. What's wrong with this faculty? Doesn't look like America. What's wrong with, this team? Doesn't look like America. The look like America theme has become, with certain latent proportionalism, has become a very powerful normative, a very powerful normative theme. So if you deviate from it, problem. Now, there's various rationales to this. And again, I think that there's various virtues to the look like America theme. You've heard some of the various rationales. One rationale is that if you have a team or a faculty or what have you that looks like America, that gives positive proof of non-exclusion. That's true. I think that's an important feature. It's an important attraction to this notion of what we want. Legitimation, the idea of, well, we want a cabinet that has various sectors of the population in it, because if we do that, we can win over the polity. It'll be a more legitimate cabinet, a more legitimate faculty, a more legitimate competition. There's the idea that things that look like America will be better because various groups have special capacities, so it is said, special insights, so it is said, special experiences, so it is said, so that, if you have a student body that is racially diverse, it'll be a more interesting, more vibrant student body because presumably you have people from various places, they can help educate one another, etc. Finally, the idea of the looks like America, it provides a validation and a protection of group identity. Those are, again, there's virtues in those things. But there are also problems. What are some of the problems with the looks like America motif? Well, one problem is, what are the groups that, what are the groups that are going to constitute the parts of the salad? I'll give you an example. Let's imagine a person, a person, frankly, like our president, who has a parent of one race and a parent of another race. Well, in some places, people who have parents of different races think of themselves as multiracial people. And in fact, at my law school, there's a multiracial student society. It's a group. On the other hand, for, a long time in American life, if you were discernibly African at all, you were black. Well, which is it? Multiracial, black? Let me give you another example of the difficulty here. Let's take the term Asian American. You could have a group, Asian American. On the other hand, there would be, I can easily imagine, and I don't have to imagine, this is not a matter of imagination, this is for real. There are people who say, I don't like that, that Asian American. I want a Filipino affinity group. I want a Japanese American affinity group. I want a Chinese American affinity group. Not this pan group that won't cut it. Well, we have a nice controversy here. What is the group? The same thing you could say with Latino, pan group. On the other hand, no, I don't want that. Puerto Rican, Cuban American, Mexican American. That's my community, not this thing that, some bureaucrat has dreamed up. There's the fight over the group. There's another problem. What about the problem of small groups? So, Bill Clinton and other presidents too, since Bill Clinton, I have a cabinet that looks like America. Cabinet has 12 people in it. 12 people. Looks like America? I mean, there are a lot of ethnic groups and for that matter, racial groups, depending on how you want to dice things, how can you possibly have, who counts for purpose of representation? And by the way, just suppose you come from a little group. I mean, proportionalism might work out if you come from a group that has a lot of people in it, because if you come from a group that has enough people in it, then, your group shows up. But just suppose you come from a little teeny, 2%. Well, your group might not ever show up. It's only 2%. How can you complain? Hey, I got a cabinet that looks like America. You come from a little teeny tiny group. Not enough of y'all to complain about. Oh, and that's an issue. Particularly, just suppose you come from a small group that works, that actually is disproportionately successful in a particular domain. What about that? Finally, the looks like America motif. The group, we want to have groups. We want to have groups involve looks like America. The looks like America metric does keep alive the idea of race, does keep alive the idea of racial groups being socially important. And of course, if you are in favor of, certainly if you're in favor of the race-blind idea, this idea of group pluralism is going to be an ideological affront to you. So where does that leave me? That leaves me trying to puzzle this thing out. I don't think it's accidental. I don't think that it's accidental that there is no text that I can point to that gives a good answer to the question that I have posed. I think that the question that I have posed is a real question, is a daunting question, is a question that will require a lot more thought, and it's a question that I'm certainly trying to attend to, and it's a question that I now will invite you to assist me in answering. Thank you very much.
We now have time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for us to come to you with a microphone. As always, priority will go to students.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question is, what do you think are the problems facing racial inclusivity on college campuses? And as a university law professor, what do you think are the steps or the policies that should be taken to address these problems?
Want to be here all night? There are a lot of problems, obviously, that are that have been pushed to the fore. I commend students in our time, as in past times, for blowing the whistle on institutional complacencies and on highlighting issues that need attention. So I'm very sympathetic to many of the dissidents who have raised their voices on campuses all across the United States. I think that they've pointed to real issues. So to name one. It's a symbolic matter, but I think a real matter. I mean, I attended college at Princeton University. I have very fond feelings for Princeton University. One of the things that students at Princeton University have been demonstrating about is the status of a very significant figure at Princeton University, namely a former president of the university, and namely a former president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. There's a college at Princeton University, the Woodrow Wilson School. And some students have said, gosh, when you take a tour of Princeton University, you learn all sorts of nice things about Woodrow Wilson. One thing that is not, spoken about is, the fact that Woodrow Wilson helped reinforce racial segregation in the federal government. Woodrow Wilson was was a white supremacist. Woodrow Wilson was racist. Woodrow Wilson, had, retrograde racial ideas. Woodrow Wilson's policies were very hurtful to, many Americans. Now, and so there's a student organization that is demanding that the university rename the Woodrow Wilson School. And they're studying this. There's a debate about it. I commend the students for blowing the whistle on Princeton's, complacency with respect to this. The issue of, what should happen, I think, is a complicated matter. I haven't really thought that completely through yet. I think that my own druthers are, and this is provisional, but I think that my own druthers are that I think I'm probably in favor of a regime of addition as opposed to subtraction. I think I'm in favor of keeping what exists for a variety of reasons, including, just the protection of memory, but addition. There are a whole bunch of people who have done wonderful things in American life who have not received the attention and valorization that their efforts warrant, and I think that Princeton and other institutions should attend to that. But my point was that, students have focused our attention on that, and I think it's a good thing. And it has occasioned thoughtfulness. My home institution, same thing. There's a big fight over the seal of Harvard Law School, because the seal of Harvard Law School is the family seal of the royal family, and the royal family, they gave a bequest, which actually became the Harvard Law School. The bequest came from the proceeds of, slavery and the slave trade. Students have also put, focused attention on other matters, the composition of curriculums, the composition of faculties. I think all these things need to be thought about, and I think that, it's dissident students who have prompted much of this thinking. That's not to say, by the way, that I agree with everything that dissident students have said and done. I'm actually quite critical of some of the positions taken and some of the strategies taken by, students in protest. I'll just be parochial and just talk again about my own institution. Harvard Law School's been in the news a good bit. There are a number of students who've really come down very hard on Harvard Law School, suggesting that it's really a site of racial oppression, gender oppression. I don't see it that way. I think it's important to distinguish. I think all these institutions, I think it's probably the case that any major institution in America is going to have a gender problem, a racial problem. That's probably true of probably any major institution in American life. I do think it's important, however, to distinguish between a problem and something that is characteristic of the institution. I don't think that my institution, for instance, I don't think that it's characteristically racist at all. I think that, in fact, the opposite. In many of our institutions of higher education, what is the prevailing ethos? The prevailing ethos is an ethos of thoughtfulness, of self-criticism, of debate, of learning, the elevation of knowledge, the valorization of knowledge. Those things are very useful. Those things are very precious. And I think that we ought to be very careful in what we do and say about our institutions of higher learning, particularly in a world that is so full of people who are fully prepared to destroy institutions like this one, institutions like mine, institutions of higher education. And so while you want to push institutions of higher education, while you do want to shine a light on their complacencies, yeah, they have complacencies, also recognize how precious they are, how fragile they are, and how important they are for anything that at least I would call a decent democracy. Other questions?
Hi, thank you so much. So I feel as though you presented two sides of the argument. You were presenting this idea of racial blind constitutionalism, which I don't really have a lot of sympathies towards that, because I feel like it detracts from, historically, we the people didn't include a large section of who we consider to be people in our modern day narrative. And then you gave this alternative formulation, which you characterized as the racial blind salad or orchestra, et cetera. And I'm wondering, is there a place in the middle of that spectrum to which you would characterize the ideal value placement in terms of the way we approach politics, criticisms of higher learning? Because to me, while you are calling for the criticism of institutions, you are also saying that we should not attack, or I guess our institutions are also vulnerable, is what you're saying. We cannot fully dismiss them because there are people who are willing to dismantle them as a form of undermining democracy, is what you were just saying. I'm just trying to get more of your sense of what you think as what strategies would be most effective in terms of addressing the historical racism that is obviously prevalent and obviously extremely relevant, even in our own institutions, even in the institution within which we stand right now, both Harvard Law School and Claremont McKenna College, while also not resigning to either this idea of racial blind constitutionalism, which is, to me, a impossible way of approaching the Constitution, or this racial blind salad orchestra idea that you presented as well.
Listen, I think our society has all sorts of inequities, and we live in a big country, all sorts of inequities. I think that people, wherever they are, whatever their situation, can do various things to advance the ball. I can't, it's not like I have a blueprint for all the situations that, confront us. Well, what do?
One-year-old college student at a predominantly white institution, and you're reflecting on both on the national scale these things that are happening, and then reflecting on them within your own personal life. And this is the environment within which you are attending classes, learning so much about these issues within the context of history, historical documents, the historical narrative. What strategies do you think would be most effective / what stance would you take? Because I had some trouble finding sort of the thesis in what you were saying. I mean, it sounds like you are willing and open to listen to, the brainstorming and the ideas that the people may have in terms of coming up with solutions. But I feel as though I'm just wondering, what would you do? What stance would you take?
You know what? I think that's a great question. I've got 2 kids. They're not college age yet. They're about 18 months away from going to college. They're juniors in college. So your question, what would I tell them? Here's what I tell them. I'd say, you're going to, you have a great privilege of going to an institution of higher learning. And what I'd advise you to do would be to maximize the strengths of the institutions that you're attending. These institutions are not, they're like everything else. Everything has its limits. You're going to college, get out of the college the most that you can get out of it. You've got 4 years in which you have the great privilege of being able to spend the great bulk of your time learning things. If I were you, I would spend the great bulk of that time increasing your human capital, your human intellectual capital, so that when you leave, you have expanded your knowledge such that over the course of your life, you will be able to do various things. So I would say, gosh, if I could do it all over again, languages, as many techniques for opening up the world as possible, master. That's what you should do in your time in college. That's my response. Now, if somebody says to me, well, gosh, Kennedy, isn't that a quietistic response? Aren't you just telling people to mind their studies and not be activists? Activism is its own sort of learning. I think that one of the some of the most intellectually impressive students I've met, both as a student and as a professor, have been people who are activists. I would say, as an activist, learn and use your activism to learn. You can use your activism to teach, but I would say to students, you don't know everything, and don't act like you know everything. Because you don't. So learn. If you see an injustice, and you think that the injustice is one that you're in a position to do something about, okay, fine. Move on it, act on it. But in my view, that ought not be the major thing that you do. And in my view, as you are acting, I would say act with some degree of humility about the state of your knowledge. I would say vis-a-vis these institutions of higher education, I would push them, but I would push them respectfully, and I would push them with a sense of collaboration. Do not make the universities your enemy. They are not your enemy. They need not be your enemy. Dissenters have enough enemies. Why make them? You got enough. For goodness sakes, don't make enemies out of institutions or people who actually you could bring on your side. And so, that's at least part of what I would say to, young people who, and God bless them for, being public-spirited, seeing injustices, and wanting to do something about that. That's great. And I say maintain that spirit, but at the same time, take the long view.
Thank you for speaking with us today. So I've noticed often that this focus on the ideal you're talking about can obscure the necessary steps and actions we need to take to improve the current state of the world. So I'm wondering what exactly you see the virtues of searching for this racial promised land to be.
Why do it? Why search for the racial promised land? In part so that we can, if we currently, we're sort of in a muddle. And when I say we, I don't want to disrespect, I am currently in a muddle. I think that my thinking would be a lot more clear if I had a clear conception of what I'm struggling to achieve. If somebody said, okay, Kennedy, tell you what, I've got a magic wand. With this magic wand, you now have the power to do anything you want. Right now, you can wave a magic wand and create the society that you want. Here's the wand. If somebody said that to me as I am at this very moment, I would be in the position of saying, uh-oh, what do I want? I'm not actually all that clear about what I want. I'm clear about certain things. I mean, American law, I teach courses. What are the courses that I teach? I teach courses on race relations law. What are courses on race relations law? Courses on race relations law in most law schools, they go under the rubric of anti-discrimination law. We are good at talking about what we don't want. We don't want certain sorts of invidious racial discrimination. We don't want segregation. We don't want slavery. It's negative. That's, in a way, that's sort of part of, that fits within American legal traditions. Our constitutional system is largely negative. We're not so good at flipping that around and giving a positive regime. Okay, so you know what you don't want, but what do you want? There, we run into trouble. And frankly, I think that if we were a bit clearer about what we wanted, I think we would be able to mobilize political forces in a more effective way, in a more sensible way. The way it is now, we're betwixt and between, we're a bit befuddled. And we obscure our befuddlement by constantly invoking abstractions like, racial justice, racial equality. But then when people sort of press us on that, exactly what do you mean by that? Exactly what do you mean by that? After 2 or 3 paragraphs, we get awfully fuzzy. Me too. And I think that that's a weakness.
Hello again. Thank you for coming. I have a question that relates to your question about the Promised Land, which Sid mentioned in his last question as well. In one of my classes this week, it's on race, education, and the law, we discussed the Massachusetts case from 1850, Roberts v. City of Boston, one of the first cases that furthered the legal doctrine of separate but equal. And at the end of our discussion, my professor shared with our class that in her view, as soon as the Massachusetts court decided that case and argued that separate but, and keeping in mind that this was before the passage of the 14th Amendment, but even so, when the Massachusetts court furthered this argument that separate but equal can count as equal protection under the law with regards to race, that set in motion this chain of events that, in her view, guaranteed that we will never have truly racial equality in public schools in the United States. And, traced the social, the legal, the constitutional ripple effects that this case led to over the next century, over the next 150 years. And I'm wondering, when you look back at American history and both social history and legal history, how do you view the relationship between the current state of racial affairs in the United States and the relationship that has to American law? How do you think that our history affects the situation that we have now? Do you think certain trends are just inevitable because of the history that we're coming from, or can they be overcome? And what would that look like to you?
It's a great question. Shall we overcome? Oh, that's what the question you asked. Shall we overcome? It's a good question. And in the history of the United States, there are 2 great traditions that have given diametrically opposed answers to that question. Let me go through those 2 traditions. There is the optimistic, let's start with the pessimistic tradition, which sounds like your teacher. The pessimistic tradition is actually a very interesting tradition. There's a tradition in American life that says, no, we shall not overcome. We shall not have racial justice in America. We shall not have racial equality in America. Who are some of the people within that tradition? Well, I'll give some names. They're familiar names. Thomas Jefferson. You read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, totally pessimistic. No, we shall not overcome. That's why Jefferson, along with many of the other statesmen of the early federal period, were in favor of sending free blacks back to Africa, because they said, there's not going to be racial justice in America. The black people are always going to remember the white people enslaved them. The white people are always going to remember that the black people were once their slaves. He was thoroughly pessimistic. Who are some of the other pessimists? One of my favorites in this tradition, person who spoke the most sobering, the darkest version, Alexis de Tocqueville. In Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville has a chapter called The 3 Races of America. There's nothing darker. He said, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. There will not be racial equality in America. Who are some of the other people? Abraham Lincoln, thoroughly pessimistic. That's why Lincoln, like Jefferson, throughout his life was interested in colonization. He said, no, you're not going to have equal neighborliness in America. Too much bad stuff has happened here. In the black nationalist tradition, Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, my colleague, Derek Bell, The Permanence of Racism. So that, there's that tradition. My father, of blessed memory, thoroughly pessimistic, never forgave the United States for its treatment of people of color. Never. And never thought that there would be racial equality in the United States. So there's that tradition. Now, there is, on the other hand, a different tradition, the optimistic tradition. In the 19th century, the great spokesperson for the optimistic tradition, one of my favorite people in the history of the world, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, former slave, was asked, even before the ratification of the 13th Amendment, do you foresee a time when there will be racial justice in America? And Frederick Douglass said, yes, I foresee that time. Now, this is remarkable. This is a guy who, had on his back the scars of enslavement. Before the ratification of the 13th Amendment, he said, not tomorrow, but I foresee a time when there will be neighborliness and racial harmony on the basis of equality in the United States. He would be one of the great spokespersons for the optimistic tradition. In the 20th century, of course, the great spokesperson for the optimistic tradition would be Martin Luther King Jr. And probably, there were a number of speeches, but probably his I Have a Dream speech would probably be the iconic example of that. Barack Obama would be certainly in our time, the most influential exponent of that view. Among white racial reformers and other non-black racial reformers, any number of people have been in the optimistic tradition. So you have these two traditions. Myself, I'm in the optimistic tradition. I'm in the optimistic tradition, and one thing I'll say, people say, well, why? And I say, again, because sometimes if you're in the optimistic tradition, people look at you and, as if you're a Pollyanna. I don't think I'm a Pollyanna. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. I did not grow up in Columbia, South Carolina because my parents were refugees from the Jim Crow South. I once asked my father, why'd you leave South Carolina? Without missing a beat, my father said, I left South Carolina because if I hadn't left, either one of two things was going to happen. Either I was going to kill a white man or a white man was going to kill me. Both were going to be bad for you children, so I got my hat and left. That's the household I grew up in. Know full well, have spent thousands of hours studying the bleakness, the terribleness of racial oppression in American life and its scars, which are all around us. So I'm not a Pollyanna about America. At the same time, at the table, we were asking about comparative view, because we had a nice international table. I would ask people to put to themselves the following question. What does the history of the United States look like compared with the history of other divided societies? 1860 is not that long ago. Now, listen, I teach students in and out, day by day by day. When I say 1960 to my students, they look at me as if I'm talking about when the dinosaur roamed or something. 1960 was like a minute ago. 1860 was not all that long ago. Really wasn't. What was the situation in 1860? 4 million African Americans chattel slaves. 4 million. 500,000 blacks so-called free. 1860. Now, a lot's changed. And again, if one wants to take a world comparative view about change in other societies, especially other slave societies, what has transpired in the United States is actually quite remarkable. And I think that people ought to, be attentive to that. I am not saying, and I've said it already, but just to be clear about it, I'll say it again. We still face a society of deeply entrenched inequities, including racial inequities. That's true. But it is also true that for a whole lot of different reasons, we have been able to generate very substantial change in America. And I think that for people of a progressive sensibility, that should be encouragement. Through the use of intelligent, heroic, concerted effort, yes, change can be effected. That's what I'd say back to your teacher.
This will be our last question.
Thank you again for coming to speak with us, Professor Kennedy. The one question I have is the Stanford professor, Richard Thompson Ford, argues in his book, Wright's Gone Wrong, that in our fervor to kind of promote racial justice, racial equality, whatever that may mean, the progressives, as I think you would say, have a tendency to perhaps overextend in a manner that actually undermines any efforts to achieve that racially just end. And so I think, especially at a college where we've struggled with debating issues of race, and when you talk about the supposedly racially neutral policies in Texas or even California, and how they don't actually engage with the issue of race, what I'm wondering is, how would you recommend that as students and as a society as a whole, we engage in race in a manner that doesn't actually undermine our end goal, in a manner that actually is able to bring those who object to policies like affirmative action into the fold rather than alienate them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I smiled when you mentioned Richard Thompson Ford. I remember him very well. He was a very, very fine student. And he was. And I know the books that you're talking about because, we trade manuscripts, and he's a very thoughtful person. To answer your question directly, I would say, again, in terms of, especially at the university, one thing about universities, and one of the things that makes universities quite special, is the university, it may default, it may fall down, it may, not reach the mark, but at least as an aspiration, it aspirationally wants and demands that people be thoughtful. And I would say that, one thing to try to really cultivate is thoughtfulness. So, among other things, that means being really, really precise. Really precise. So, you say to somebody, I feel such and such a way. Then the person says to you, okay, I don't quite understand why you feel the way you feel. Give me an example. Fine, so give an example. And, don't get huffy when somebody says, give me an example. It's a perfectly valid question, give me an example. Here's an example of how I feel. If somebody says, I'm not persuaded, okay, well, I've tried persuading you this way. Let me try to persuade you this way. I think that especially on college campuses, we need to go to fundamentals and demand of ourselves that we are really trying to be as thoughtful as we can possibly be. By the way, in full recognition that some people are not going to appreciate that. Not everybody is going to be thoughtful. Some people are going to be actually contemptuous of your even trying to be thoughtful. Okay, fine. But even in light of that, I would urge people to use the tools that you're presumably being taught in your classes. Precision, a real attentiveness to fact, a real attentiveness to what you don't know, a real attentiveness to things that need further investigation, a real attentiveness to the virtues of experimentation, a real attentiveness to listening carefully to other people. Those are some of the things that I think that people, whatever your ideological predisposition, those are scholarly / intellectual virtues that I think will strengthen anyone. Listen, you all have been very patient. Again, thank you very much for listening to me.